but questions we don't always discuss. And so I thought, many people are more than just verbal learners, they're visual learners. And if we're speaking about elephants in the room, we should bring in a prop. And so I did some looking, I did some asking, and I was told emphatically that I could not bring a live elephant into this place. And so I did what was second best. I know it doesn't quite have the wow effect, but maybe it'll be helpful for some of us as we think about this series. It was actually given to me by a friend. I'm a little nervous to put it by the candles, but no, we'll put it down low here. I thought it'd be a little bit more exaggerated than that, but that's kind of where we're at. But welcome if you're new. My name is Joel. I am one of the pastors here, and we're starting this new series that is going to deal with some of the questions, some of the elephants that perhaps we don't want to talk about in the midst of life, in the midst of faith. Questions, though, that when we start to look at the Bible, we realize that God wants us to not only know, but to understand. That faith is not a reality or an expectation that we don't have questions, that we don't have doubts, that we don't always have all the answers. But rather, faith is that reality, that intersection when we come to the place of saying, in the midst of life, in the midst of challenges, in the midst of difficulties, God, I'm going to lean in on you to see what you have to say in the midst of all of life. And so it's kind of a bit of a two-sided series. We're only going to deal with the elephants in the room, but the series has actually been entitled Big Butts in the Bible. Big Butts in the Bible. And look at how the Bible actually addresses some significant realities in all of life. And so this morning, we want to talk about how do we deal with the difficulties of life. How do we deal with those moments where we may ask God of something? That we find ourselves in a difficulty, we find ourselves in a struggle, we find ourselves in a place of suffering. And what we are asking of God is that He would remove whatever challenge we are facing. That He would help us be able to step over the obstacle that we are dealing with. And we all know that suffering is not simply one of those conversations of saying, if it happens, but more along the lines of when it happens. When a job is lost, when we become sick, when a loved one dies, when that relationship we had invested so much time and energy and effort into seems to crumble. And the list could go on and on and on. We know that in the midst of life, we are not immune. So the question I want to kind of lock in on here this morning is how do we respond when God doesn't seemingly answer in a way that we would want, in a way that we would expect, and in a way that we would hope? Do we grin and bear it? Do we just say, well, I guess that's the reality, and let's just go on my merry little way, which isn't very merry at all? Do we walk away from faith and say, you know what, God, if you're not going to show up in the midst of this, my most difficult moment, then what is the point? What good are you to me? Do we just kind of ignore it, or do we try to explain it away with, cliches or metaphors that as they're leaving our mouth, we're like, this makes no sense at all. And actually, what I've just said isn't actually bringing any comfort to me or anyone at all. And so how do we respond when it seems as if God is not responding to some of our greatest needs? Because I notice this interesting reality in life, that as I come in contact with people who suffer and who face difficulties, you see oftentimes what happens is it's through the midst of the difficulty that they either draw closer to God or they begin to distance themselves from God. And the place we want to begin to land is how does this reality begin to shape us and draw us closer to God? Because it's important for us to notice, perhaps you're someone who's just considering Christianity, you're still not quite there yet. Needed for us to understand that when Jesus promises us the abundant life, it's not a life that is without difficulties. It's not a life that is without struggle. It's not a life that is without sorrow and without grief. It's not as if it's like, you know what, I'm going to bring you into your happy place, and you're just going to dwell in your happy place, and nothing ever bad is going to happen to you again. Because if I said that was the reality, those of you who follow Jesus would probably raise your hand and say, I got an issue with that. And rightly so. On the flip side of it, there's times when people find themselves in situations and that because of the difficulties that they are going through, they begin to think, well, this is the reason why I don't believe in God. But here's the crux of the matter. Regardless of what you believe, whether you are a Christian, whether you're an atheist, whether you're a Muslim, whether you're a Buddhist, whether you don't know what you believe, no one is exempt from suffering. No one is exempt. And so if you make the choice of saying, I am not going to believe in God because of the difficulties in my life, that is a choice you're going to make, but it's not going to make the suffering disappear. We are all left with a place of landing in how do I deal with suffering? How do I deal with the difficulties of life? And so I think as a first step, it's by simply acknowledging this reality. Second step is beginning to simply talk about what this begins to look like. And so we're going to look at a passage in the Bible. We're going to turn to a passage that may be familiar to you. If you want to start turning there, it's Daniel chapter 3. We're going to read it in a moment. It's a story that I first heard when I was a lot younger in Sunday school, and they had flannel graphs. Anyone ever remember flannel graphs? A few people, right? All right. Yeah, you kind of throw the pictures up there and you kind of follow the story along. And, some of our kids are learning it. But maybe some of you don't know the story. So here's a real quick background. It's over 2,500 years ago that this took place. So about 500 years before Jesus and his ministry on this earth. And it's a time where the people of God, the nation of Israel, were going through an incredible, difficult time. They were suffering in a way that probably many of us would have never experienced before. You see, what God did was God established a nation called Israel. And he says, I'm going to be faithful to you. You be faithful to me. I'm going to bless you so that you can be a blessing to others. And things would go well for a little bit and then not really well. Well, this was a period in Israel's history where things had completely blown up. That they had been conquered by another nation, the Babylonians. And the Babylonians have not only come in and conquered them, they have completely attempted to remove any remnant of their culture and Jewish history. They have destroyed their homes. They have destroyed their temple. They have taken them out of Israel and brought them into Babylon. Think modern day Iraq, about 50 miles outside of Baghdad. And they are attempting to assimilate God's people by removing their culture, by removing their language, by removing their religion, and even by removing their names. Think about that for a moment. Imagine some other nation came in here and not only knocked down our homes, not only knocked down this church, but took us physically out of Canada, landed us in a new land, and started changing everything about what we could say, about what we could wear, about what we could talk about. And they even started calling you a different name. You think you might start to have some issues with God. You think you might want to say, God, why is this happening? What on earth is going on? And so that is the context of what we're about to jump into. Because in Daniel chapter 3, there's one particular time where the king of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar, decides that in addition to everything else he's doing, he is going to erect a massive statue. And he decided that at the sound of any music being played, that everyone must bow down to this statue. as an act of worship, as a means of serving one of their gods. And so imagine you're just I was just thinking about this week, like if you're just going about your daily routine, you're doing your usual thing, and then suddenly the music starts to play, and everyone, has to literally bow down and start to worship this statue. You could be having a conversation, you could be cooking dinner, you could be out playing with the kids, you could be playing sports, and if the music started to blare, you stop what you do and you start to worship. And so you realize that this was a regular occurrence. This would also be a public occurrence. And so you couldn't get away from it because everyone would know if you weren't following the king's decree because you'd be the only person standing. And the king was so serious about this, he's like, listen, this is a you're all in sort of a deal. That if you do not bow down to the statue that I have created, then I'm going to take your life. I am going to throw you into a blazing furnace. Not like I'm going to fine you, not like I'm going to imprison you. I am going to take life from you. Well, there's 3 guys. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Not their original names. They had been changed. And they would hear the music, and because they were faithful to God, and they know that God says, you shall have no other gods before me, you shall bow down to no one. They were faithful to God. Even in the midst of everything else that had happened to them, they were still being faithful to God. And so when the music blared, they didn't get down. They refused to bow down. Well, guess what? People saw it. People heard about it. And people scurried quickly to the king and said, hey, guess what? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're refusing to follow your decree, O king. What are you going to do? So with that, we're going to read what happens next. Daniel chapter 3. Heather's going to come up and read it for us. It's on the screens. We're going to begin with verse 13 if you want to turn there in your Bibles or swipe there on your phones.
Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. Even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. May God bless his holy word.
Now, for those of you that are familiar with this story and perhaps have read it before or kind of know it a little bit or maybe seen the VeggieTales version of it, you know, this is not the end of the story, right? But I want you to kind of put it on pause for a moment because one of the dangers and the temptations is that when we read the Bible, we jump automatically to the end. And we think, okay, well, I know how this story is going to go, and we're going to continue on in the midst of it. But understand, if you're Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, this is real time. This is not like, okay, tell me how the story is going to end, and then I'll get on board, God. No, they made the decision. They landed in the place of saying, listen, we are refusing to bow down and to serve any other God. And they understood what was at stake. And the place I want to land here this morning is not necessarily just how the story ends, but an incredible statement of faith that these three men made. Because they're brought before the king. And the king says, listen, I'm going to give you one more chance. Maybe you didn't hear the music. Maybe you just didn't feel like getting down. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to give you another chance. We're going to pipe the sound in. We're going to play some music for you. And when you hear the music, if you bow down and worship the idol we've set up, all will be good. Because maybe Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, maybe you're confused. Maybe you were just uncertain as to what exactly I was asking of you. So I'm going to give you one more chance. And listen to what they say in verse 17. It says, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it. And he will rescue us from your hand. I so appreciate what they're saying. They're like, we understand what's at stake. We also understand that God is able to overcome. That God is able to save us. And I would have to think that those are words, that's probably the direction they're hoping this story is going to go. Right? They're saying, we know that God is able to save us. We don't think that God is unable to do this. We believe that God is able to intervene in a miraculous way. But it doesn't end there. They continue on, and this is where I want us to land. But we know that God is able to save us. But one of the big buts in the Bible. But even if he does not, we will not bow down. We will not walk away from God. What's the takeaway for us? I think what we begin to see in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Courage, yeah. But a faith that is not based upon circumstances. I think this is often a trap that we can fall into. A circumstantial faith. That God, if you do this, then I will believe. God, if you deliver me from this, then I will trust. God, if you restore this relationship, then I'll realize that you are in control. But that's not what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were doing. They understood that their faith and their trust and their dependence upon God was not based upon the circumstances or the situation, but rather they dealt with the circumstances and the situations in life because of their faith in God. And that is a huge but. That's a hard but. It's one thing to say, God, if you come through for me in the way that I would hope or the way that I'd expect, then of course I'm going to worship you. Of course I'm going to be faithful to you. But to utter the words, God, even if this doesn't swing the way I want it to, I will still believe. I will still trust. I will still hope. And I think it's this response of Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego that we can begin to land in a place of understanding how we can maintain faith, even in the midst of difficulties, even in the midst of suffering, even in the midst of hardships. Because you start to read the Bible, you realize that time and time again, people who are faithful face difficulties in life. And oftentimes, the immediate response, the natural response, is to cry out to God and to say, God, why? But so often, God in the Bible is silent on the why. And as you start to push it even further, if in knowing the why, would it relieve any of the pain? But rather, what God begins to unveil for us is not the why of suffering, but rather the how we walk through the suffering. It's a Christian writer by the name of Lewis Smedes, and he writes on the topic of suffering. And he talks about how there are really two types of suffering. That as I heard him and as I read this, it was just helpful for me. And he talks about suffering from something and then suffering with someone. And they're distinctly different. Suffering from something, you oftentimes don't have control over. You don't have a choice in. And we've all suffered from something or some things, plural, right? Sometimes we suffer from things because we make bad decisions. We make poor choices. We make boneheaded calls, and we pay the consequences as a result. That is one reality. But then we also suffer from some things in this world that we didn't deserve, that we didn't see coming, that we don't really own at all. But we didn't have the option to say, I'm gonna opt out of that one. No, we all suffer from something. We have no control over that. But Smedes talks about the reality is that as Christians, as followers of Jesus, we have a choice to respond in a different way. But not just simply throwing up our hands, not just simply saying, well, this is the reality, but by making the choice of saying, in the midst of suffering from something, I am going to suffer with someone. And that is a choice. That is a choice that we make, and that is a choice that I am sure many of you have made. I'm sure that is a choice that many others have made for you. You know, we suffer with someone when we choose to enter into the difficulty with them. Not with answers, not with the reasons, not with the way out, but to simply say, I'm going to come alongside with you. Suffering with someone is when we show up at the hospital of someone we dearly love who is sick and we desire that they'd get better. But we suffer with them by sitting with them. We suffer with people when we show up to funerals and say, in the midst of your sadness and your grief, you are not alone. I am with you. We suffer with one another. When someone loses a job or when someone faces a difficult decision and we come alongside them to say, I am with you. Henry Nouwen, another great Christian writer, speaks of one of the greatest gifts and ministries we can give is the ministry of presence. The ministry of walking alongside with others. You start to read through the New Testament, and Jesus offers all these reminders of this one another. Serve one another. Love one another. Forgive one another. The reality of life with Jesus is that we do it with one another. And that comes out loud and clear in Daniel chapter 3. I don't want to leave any of you on a cliffhanger wondering, okay, how does the story end? So we're gonna wrap it up. Just throw it back up on the screens. And so after Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been thrown into the blazing furnace, quick recap, I know sometimes short-term memory just out the door. The guys who threw them into the furnace have already died, right? Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, Weren't there 3 men that were tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, "Certainly, O king," he said. "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. An amazing story. Amazing reality. We're told that when they were pulled out of the fire, they didn't even smell like smoke. We were told before they went into the fire, all the clothes they were wearing, all the things they had on their body. And when they were pulled out of the fire, not only did they not die, they didn't even smell like they had been around a campfire. But let's not miss the reality of what God is wanting to tell us. Because the amazing thing about what goes on here is that this is the reality of suffering with someone. The king jumps to his feet and is like, whoa, 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 whoa. I need to rub my eyes. Someone give me your glasses. We put 3 in there, and now there's 4. Now there's 4. They're unbound. They're walking around. Like, I so appreciate the detail. Biblical scholars say, it's really kind of one of 2 explanations that really land in the same conclusion. One is that it's the pre-incarnate Christ. The others would say it's an angel. Regardless of where you land on that interpretation, the reality is this, is that God was with them in the furnace. God was with them. God didn't say, listen, I want to see the strength of your faith. I want to see the strength of your dependence. You get into the furnace, and I'll be on the other side, watching you, cheering for you, rooting for you. No, God got into the furnace and was with them. One of the amazing things about Christianity, that when you start to look at it based upon other religions and other beliefs, is that Christianity, we focus as part of the story, not just simply on the glory of God and the resurrection, but the suffering of God and the willingness of God to bear the hurt and the burdens of this world, not only so that we will be forgiven, but as an incredible reminder that God is with us. See, if we simply look to the cross as being the reality of, well, I'll be forgiven for my sins, and then one day if I die or when I die, I will go to heaven and I'll spend eternity, and that is part of the reality. But then just simply holding to that belief means that in the midst of life, we're then left and stuck with everything else. But the cross is so much more. The cross is a reminder of Jesus saying, I am with you. I am in this moment with you. And I think one of the great reminders of how we allow this big but to become a part of our faith is knowing that even if life doesn't go the way we'd expect God to turn it for us, that does not disqualify his presence from being with us. One of the great Psalms, perhaps, if you know a Psalm, you likely know this one. Psalm 23. When David says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will not be afraid. Okay, David, why? Why will you not be afraid? Because God, you are with me. We don't worship a distant God. We worship a with God, with you, with me, with us. And that enables us to walk through the suffering and the difficulties and the hardships. I wish I could stand here this morning and say, you know what? Believe in Jesus and you won't have difficulties. Or believe in Jesus and here is the way to kind of solve your problems, to deal with your solutions. I don't have those answers. But what I do know is that we have an opportunity to walk with God in the midst of whatever we are facing. One more thought before we conclude. And that is the fact that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were with one another. One of the great gifts that God gives to us in all of life is the gift of one another. The gift of community. And what I've experienced in my life is one of the best ways, one of the most profound ways that I am able to be reminded that God is with me in the midst of hardships and difficulties, is in knowing that there are others walking with me as well. You hear us talk often about small groups, about the various groups that meet throughout the church. Groups that meet in homes, groups that meet in restaurants, groups that meet in the church. And you can sometimes wonder, what is all of that about? I meet with a group of guys on Tuesday night, second and fourth Tuesday of the night. And we do a lot of things together. We laugh with one another. We make fun of one another. We support one another. We encourage one another. These are some of my with guys. The ones who've walked with me. The ones I've walked with as well. To help encourage. To help support. I know for many of you, you have your with people as well. But if you don't, the best thing you can do is begin to find your with people. Because they are the ones that will come alongside, that will support you, that will encourage you, that will enable you in the midst of the difficulties of life, remind you that God is with you. God is with you. Let's stand.